they don't resort to violence first. They always resort to cleverness. You know, here in the United States, the American government has depicted these individuals as if they're predators, as if they're tigers. They're not tigers. They're house cats, but they're very clever house cats. And so twice in their history, they were able to manipulate the American government into wiping out their enemies. See, when they were stuck in that pincer movement in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Zambada, that's where he reached into his cleverness bag. He contacted the attorney in San Diego. The attorney in San Diego started feeding information to the Department of Justice. So, you know, they believe they operate under the principle identified by the military strategist, Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They don't have to be stronger than Tijuana. They just need an ally who's stronger. Well, they have an uncle, Uncle Sam.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Welcome to Borderland, Narcosis, and Ironclad Original. Our next guest is Pierre Rausini, who is an author and a former Los Angeles kingpin. He was charged with operating a criminal enterprise under the Federal Drug Kingpin Statute and prosecuted for participating in wide-ranging drug conspiracies. Rausini's extensive history of drug trafficking in Southern California throughout the 1990s involved direct collaboration with high-level Sinaloa operatives who managed the cartel's American-based distribution network and its money laundering operations. This experience provided him with an intimate understanding of the cartel's logistics and operational strategies.
Yeah, I don't look like you're what most people think a large drug trafficker looks like.
No, don't worry. We've had a few other individuals, and I don't think I'm not one to judge what anyone looks like in a particular field. Most people judge me and didn't realize I was a federal agent in a special operations unit.
Sure, of course.
So,
no.
Well, Pierre, before we get started, what I want to do is kind of read the first paragraph of your email, so the audience will kind of hear what we received, because I think that was one of the most fascinating emails we've ever received, and to hear it was just it made me have a lot of questions. So I'm going to start. It says, I write to you to express interest in appearing on your platform to bring a former trafficker's perspective to the discussion about utilizing military assets to attack the Mexican drug cartels. Unfortunately, the discussions I have heard on your platform and many others is uninformed because none of our guests or none of your guests understand how the cartels are structured and why. In the case of Sinaloa, this particular alliance of drug traffickers has exhibited such remarkable organizational resilience such that they've withstood 35 years of continuous assaults by our most powerful law enforcement and intelligence gathering agencies, FBI, DEA, CIA, and NSA. Our government has spent 3 decades and tens of billions of dollars attempting to cripple this collection of organizations led by functionally literate men with 3rd, 4th, 5th grade educations. And yet all of our government's efforts to date have failed by every conceivable metric. Damn. So when that was read to me, I was blown away by just that comment alone, and it makes me very excited to have this conversation.
Great. Thank you.
Pierre, if you wouldn't mind, give me a little bit of a short bio of your life, just so the audience will know, and then we'll get digging into the questions, because I'd love to hear. I mean, there's layers to this email that I want to get into, but please, just so the audience knows who was talking.
Well, my name is Pierre Rausini. I'm from Los Angeles. I was got involved at a younger age in the drug trafficking space, and made my way up to a fairly significant level. I was ultimately charged in multiple federal prosecutions under the Federal Drug Kingpin Statute. I received a 30-year sentence, of which I spent just 26 years in prison, got released last year. And as a non-Mexican Latino with fairly significant connections, I was always welcome within the Mexican prisoner community. And so over the course of the past 2 decades, I've lived with the men, I've eaten with the men. And so I've really gotten to know them on a personal level and how they think, how they approach their problem solving, how they structure their operations. I have a deep understanding into them personally and culturally. And I think that those elements are missing from a lot of the discussions. And quite frankly, you see here in the United States, there's just a fundamental misapprehension as to how the cartel organizations are structured and what the very purpose of the cartel is. And quite frankly, their operations are very modest in the United States, contrary to how it's depicted. Quite frankly, there aren't too many operatives in the US. See, we've gotten to the point now where being a member of a cartel means you're Mexican. Well, the overwhelming majority of Mexican traffickers in the United States are not associated with any cartel organization. Here in the US, we have a very serious problem from the drug trafficking perspective in that you have a large number of foreign nationals operating in the US. Within that foreign national drug trafficking set, there's a subset, which are the Mexican nationals. They are the largest. But within that subset, the number of actual cartel guys is shockingly small. Like I was at a federal prison in California that had 2,000 men, and that prison is known as having the most cartel guys in any prison on the federal system. And out of 2,000 men, we had 1,100 to 1,200 Mexican or Mexican-American traffickers. And out of those 1,200 guys, maybe 25 to 35 guys were cartel. It's shockingly small.
So what prison was that, if you don't mind me asking?
I started off at the maximum security levels, and I made my way down to the California prison, was at the medium at Lompoc.
Okay. And then when you say, what is it that what's the difference or that differentiates the two, just a regular smuggler to a cartel member?
Well, first of all, the cartel isn't a monolith. They don't identify themselves that way. So you may have guys that work for Zambada's organization. They don't identify themselves as Sinaloa cartel. They're just working for Zambada. And so you have a collection of organizations came together to form this structure, each of which take different areas of responsibility. Like I sent your producer a schematic for the Sinaloa cartel. That network is 44 organizations large. Of those 44 organizations, the overwhelming majority of them are in Mexico. They have nobody in the United States at all. You got maritime operations on the coast in Nayarit, aviation operations in Acapulco. Those guys those have nothing to do with the U.S. Only a handful of the organizations actually have people in the United States. So when you think, for instance, Sinaloa, and I'm from Los Angeles, and Los Angeles has been the home base for Sinaloa now for 35 years. It's their principal base of operations in the United States. Same thing with Jalisco, because Jalisco used to be a part of Sinaloa, so they broke away. They've essentially mirror each other's operations. Like I'm not really competent to talk about the Gulf side because I really had no interactions with those individuals. But with respect to Sinaloa and Jalisco, their operations in the United States are primarily logistical. The majority of the transactions are negotiated in Mexico or in Los Angeles. See, what people don't understand is that the market in the United States is dynamic. The price in Chicago for a kilo may be $23,000 a key. Well, in Los Angeles, it's 18. So if you're going to buy 100 kilos, are you going to pay 2.3 million or 1.8 million? Of course, you come to LA. The overwhelming majority of large trafficking transactions, I'm talking 7 figures and up, happen in Los Angeles. You take delivery in one of the 3 regional distribution hubs east of the Mississippi. So for Sinaloa, they operate out of Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and then there's a logistical hub in North Carolina right outside of Bragg. Those are the only 4 places you'll find cartel operatives east of the Mississippi. There are 0 cartel members of Sinaloa in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, Virginia. None of those people that are Mexicans operating in that area are cartel members. They're the customers of the cartel. See, if you're a Mexican national, you're in a privileged position because you can deal directly with the cartel distributor. So if you're a guy in Cincinnati, you either deal with the distributor out of Chicago and pay the Chicago price, or if you have a better connection, you come to Los Angeles and pay the Los Angeles price. If you have an even better connection, you go to Tijuana, you pay the Tijuana price. As you get closer to Mexico, the price is dropping. LA is only 2 hours from the border. So now, guys from New York come to LA, guys from Seattle come to LA. Now they may take delivery from their regional hub. Like they don't deliver the last mile. So if you're out of Cleveland You got to take possession of the product in Chicago. Now, you can either transport it from Chicago to Cleveland or Chicago to Detroit yourself, or you pay one of the local groups, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, non-associated Mexicans. None of those people are cartel. None of the wholesale level customers are cartel. Literally, east of the Mississippi, you might have for the entire Sinaloa cartel cocaine operation, 25 guys. Which is a fundamentally different picture than how it's depicted. Now, west of the Mississippi, they have the primary hub, which is Los Angeles, which is maybe 30 guys. I'm talking, there's less than 65 guys handling the entire cocaine operation in the United States for all of Sinaloa. You'll have a distribution hub in Denver, and then you have a secondary importation hub that's an emergency in Phoenix. They always have redundancies. And that's basically it. There's 5 places in the U.S. where they operate.
Is this... I'm like blown away, and I don't mean to laugh. I'm just kind of shocked. This is public knowledge?
It's very well known throughout the law enforcement community, but you have to understand, law enforcement works on the premise of bringing cases. And in courts, and I spent 20 years of my life in courts. And in courts, they are allowed to use presumptions. And so there's an element of conspiracy law that allows for the government to characterize us as co-conspirators. And so, for instance, if you were from Chicago and you're coming to LA to buy product from me, you're not my customer. The government characterizes you as my Chicago distributor. That's a fundamentally flawed way of looking at it. Now, you can do that in court, but in the real world, it skews the discussion. See, part of the problem we have in our country is that we're not defining the adversary correctly. And if you don't define the adversary correctly, whatever solutions you propose are not only going to resolve the issue you're trying to address, you're actually going to exacerbate the very problem, which is essentially what's happened for the last 40 years of our drug war.
Let's go back to your beginnings. What got you started in the drug smuggling world?
I wasn't involved in smuggling. Well, first of all, you have to understand, as an American, you are not going to ever deal with a cartel distributor. You have to either be Mexican national or a Mexican American with a direct blood tie for which somebody in Mexico can vouch for. You know, when you're a Mexican national operating in the United States, they get 20 tons every 3 weeks to LA. That's 20,000 kilos. They got to turn 20,000 kilos in 3 weeks. Well, what's your threat vector? Americans. There are no foreign national FBI agents or DEA agents. So if you exclude all contact with Americans, the probability of getting infiltrated plummets to damn near zero. Now, that's on the distribution side. There is an aspect of it where they do utilize Americans, and that's if you have a special skill. So, for instance, if you're a pilot, if you have a trucking company and you have a fleet of a half a dozen trucks, they want to talk to you. If you're a chemist, a banker, engineer, they're not using you for the purposes of selling their product. They won't give you an account to go get 200 kilos on credit, but they will use your services as a transporter with your airplane. Well, for me, my initial foray wasn't actually in the drug trafficking context at all. I was heavily recruited in the service. I scored in the top 2% of the state of California, top 5% in the nation, full scholarships. And back in my era in the 80s, there wasn't too many people involved with programming. And so when I was recruited, I got scholarship through the service, and I went through the program. I was a computer geek growing up. So I completed A school. I ended up suffering an injury. So I got in an accident. So I spent basically 6 months on crutches. And so while I was stuck at home, I started fiddling around with cell phones. And so as a 19-year-old, I was able to learn how to reprogram cell phones so that you didn't have to pay for the calls. Now, it's just 19-year-old silliness. Well, a few years later, and then I got involved with selling ecstasy with some high school friends. So I would just reprogram our phones so that we wouldn't have to pay for the service. A few years later, when the Motorola flip phone came out, it was really popular with drug traffickers. And I was able to get my hand on the programs to reprogram those phones. Now, this is what took it to a different level, because I changed numbers faster than the FBI can get the wiretaps. So I was able to thwart the FBI's ability to wiretap communications. As you can imagine, this would be a service that would be very popular within the trafficking community. So by that point, I was already a very substantial ecstasy trafficker. And then I started providing the service for other drug traffickers. And the way I would obtain the information, we built some scanning equipment. I'd go grab a room at the Mondrian on Sunset Boulevard. So every car going into Beverly Hills, if they had their cell phone out, I would pirate their data. So the manner in which I would obtain the information was 100% purely random. So not only could I thwart the FBI's ability to wiretap, but I could also thwart the FBI's ability to use roving wiretaps. So by the time I was 24 years old, you've got two different Sinaloa cells, plus the Italians in Los Angeles, plus the mob guys in Vegas, plus the Chinese, plus the Russians. I'm doing everybody's phones. And so I was able to become acquainted with a lot. This is what the government considers telecommunications fraud. And so that was my segue into meeting these individuals. Like for them, I wasn't the drug trafficker. I was the Brazilian who was a hacker. I had a specialized skill. And so I was able to parlay that relationship later on and say, hey, can I get some of your guys' product? Because I had a friend in Beverly Hills who wanted to get some product. They're like, hey, tell your gringo friend, sorry, we can't even talk to him. Like, we'll have Johnny talk to you and you talk to him. So I had to deal with the cutout. And so that's basically the background. Is, you know, it was, they viewed me as someone that was an asset simply because I was able to provide a service, no different than a truck driver with a big rig or a pilot with an aircraft. And from there, it parlayed into what later on became a significant trafficking relationship. Now, the reason why they were interested in it is because the ecstasy operation I was a part of, we had a retired chemistry professor from the University of Southern California developed a formula to produce pharmaceutical grade compounds out of non-regulated chemicals. So we had what was probably the most sophisticated lab in the US producing ecstasy. And that led into an ecstasy trafficking relationship with some of the cartel guys because they'd want to party and do ecstasy. Well, we had the highest quality material in Los Angeles. And so it started with the telecommunications fraud, parlayed into the ecstasy, parlayed into the cocaine. And then they said, hey, can you produce our ice? They wanted the highly purified form of crystal methamphetamine. They're like, why don't you grab your chemist, your gringo friends, and come to Mexico? Like, no, we're not coming to Mexico. I'm not going to do that. But if you want, you can send us the product and we'll just whip it up for you. And so we ended up having like a network of maybe a half a dozen labs. Two of them were in Beverly Hills, one in Benedict Canyon, one in Coldwater Canyon, on the backside past Mulholland facing Sherman Oaks. We had another one where
I know the area.
Huh? Are you familiar with the area? Yeah. Yeah, two of them in Hollywood Hills. And then we had one on Sunset Plaza overlooking the LA Basin. And then the last one was in Marina Del Rey. And so that's basically that was the development. So from their perspective, I was the hacker who had a chemist, which is different than most dynamics.
Yeah, but you were trusted enough that they were willing to work with you.
On the chemistry side, yes. Like if I were to go to them and say, hey, let me get 200 kilos of coke, they say, sorry, go deal with Johnny.
Got it.
Because they weren't authorized to deal with Americans.
Yeah.
You couldn't set up an account. Because you understand, the Mexican national is privileged because one, they know you can't be a federal law enforcement officer. Two, they're able to vet you because they can speak with other individuals within the higher level trafficking community to gather your reputation. And three, before they set up an account for you, they're going to know where your family lives back home.
Mm.
So if your parents live in Guadalajara, okay, where's their address? Check. Siblings, check. Where's your wife live? Her family? Oh, Cuernavaca, beautiful. Check. Parents, siblings. So when they set up an account for you in Los Angeles, your family back in Mexico are the guarantee.
Yeah, that's collateral. That's
the security. That's why there's very few actual cartel cases. Like I see these, we sit in prison, we just laugh. You see the Attorney General announcing 240 members of the Zambada organization arrested in Los Angeles or arrested in the United States. There's not 240 people in the entire organization in Mexico, much less in the United States. They got 10 guys in LA. That was the biggest cell in the entire country, was 10 men. That was Zambadas. They received the shipments every 3 to 4 weeks, 10, 15, 20 tons.
So you get 20 years, you get 30 years, excuse me.
I got 34 total.
34 total. You spend time in prison. You're surrounded by Mexican nationals. You're surrounded by all the conversations. You learn a lot more. Does your time in prison bring you closer to understanding the organization?
Sure, certainly. Certainly. And you really have to appreciate the history because Sinaloa, more so than the others, because when Sinaloa began, they were the smallest of the organization, of the structures. A decade into their existence, the first full year of the Sinaloa Cartel's operation was 1990. By 1999, they were on their last legs. I mean, they lost their ally with Amaro Carrillo, who had passed away. Tijuana was 3 times the size of Sinaloa. The Gulf was 2.5 times the size, and the Gulf had their military wing, the Zetas. And so Sinaloa was trapped in a pincer movement. They're coming from the north in Tijuana. They're coming from the east with the Gulf. Zetas are just rolling up plazas. And so Sinaloa has always relied on craft and wit to outsmart their more powerful adversaries. They were unique in that Sinaloa is 1,000 miles from the border. They're not a border state. Everybody else was just picking up money off the ground. Well, they had to go 1,000 miles. They had to fight through rival territory to get to the border crossings. They weren't even strong enough to take a border city on the American side. They had to settle for Los Angeles. Los Angeles is disadvantageous from a smuggling perspective. Now, from a distribution hub, it was remarkably wonderful. But at the time, they didn't choose LA because that was their choice. They had no choice because Tijuana took San Diego. And so for you to, once you understand that history, you see how they approach their problems. They don't resort to violence first. They always resort to cleverness. You know, here in the United States, the American government has depicted these individuals as if they're predators, as if they're tigers. They're not tigers. They're house cats, but they're very clever house cats. And so twice in their history, they were able to manipulate the American government into wiping out their enemies. See, when they were stuck in that pincer movement in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Zambada, that's where he reached into his cleverness bag. He contacted the attorney in San Diego. The attorney in San Diego started feeding information to the Department of Justice. So, you know, they operate under the principle identified by the military strategist, Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They don't have to be stronger than Tijuana. They just need an ally who's stronger. Well, they have an uncle, Uncle Sam. So they fed the information to the American government. The American government took out Tijuana's leadership in decapitation strikes. See, George W. Bush thought it was a great victory on the war on drugs. They didn't realize they were being manipulated the whole time. In 2002, they crippled Tijuana. In 2003, they took out Ocio Cardenas, crippled the Gulf Cartel. In 2004, they crippled Cadillo Fuentes out in Juarez. Well, they went from being on their last legs in 99 to 2005. They're the most powerful cartel in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
The American government wiped out their enemies. And so when you look at these individuals, they're not, how can I say this? They're not the predators. When they organized this cartel, it was a security pact. You know, people think that they put together these groups in order for the purposes of maximizing profits. That's what the drug organization does. The collection of drug organizations came together for security. Think of it like NATO. Well, that's what their primary focus is as a cartel. They have to ensure the safety of the constituent organizations.
It's a lot of information. I'm going to get to something, but before that, you know, you talked about Zambada, but some of the other things that's happened recently with the Sinaloa cartel was El Mayo, the capturing of El Mayo.
Sure.
One person I interviewed believes that El Mayo was connected to, at that time, some kind of CIA connection. Is there any word of that? Have you heard any of that? That there's a tie into that?
Well, after 9/11, it was common knowledge throughout the higher level trafficking community that Sinaloa had been approached, and word on the Mexican side was no Arabs are to go into the U.S. Like they shut down the border, notify them about any Arabs trying to get into the country. So some agency contacted them. Now, who did it? No one knows. I'm not going to speculate. But there was an effort on their part to make sure that no Arabs were coming across the border. Now, it's not so much a contact with the CIA. What's documented is the contact with the Department of Justice. Because like I said, for 7 years, they fed information to DOJ and to the DEA for the purposes of taking out their enemies.
Right.
Now, there was a second incident where the attorney in San Diego, after doing this for 7 years, he wanted to step down. He's an older guy. He wants to retire. So they needed to put a new substitute that's going to be the conduit for information. Well, Zambada put his son in that position. So Vicente Zambada, the heir apparent, one of the biggest drug lords in all of Mexico, he's meeting with DOJ officials. He's meeting with DEA officials. And the American government officials are operating in Mexico without declaring their presence. And so this whole thing blew up because there was a meeting in DF in Mexico City where Zambada left the meeting with the Americans, gave them the intel that they were there for. And as he's walking out of the hotel, some cop notices him. Like, this is one of the most wanted men in Mexico. So he calls for backup and they arrest Zambada Jr., Vicente. And so when they arrest him, he's like, what are you guys doing? I'm here helping you. Like, what do you mean you're helping us? You're under arrest. He's like, no, I'm here meeting with the gringos. Like, gringos? What gringos? They're up in room 404. The Mexican police stumble upon a whole group of guys from Washington, D.C. and California that were operating clandestinely in Mexico. See, this was an enormous story in Mexico. Didn't get so much coverage here in the United States. But there is not a Mexican national in Mexico who is not convinced the American government created Sinaloa.
Really?
It'd be the equivalent of John Gotti's son meeting with Donald Trump Jr. I mean, it's like, and to be that kind of a level, and then they caught the federal agents. Like, what are you guys doing here operating illegally on Mexican soil? And you're meeting with the drug lord? I mean, Vicente Zambada was charged for hundreds of tons already. The guy's coming and going. They never arrested him. There was a collaboration. There was a working relationship between federal law enforcement and the Zambada faction of the Sinaloa cartel. So when Zambada actually when the son actually got sent to the United States, his attorneys were able to use that dynamic as leverage. He ended up getting only 14 years. Well, and when the attorneys tried presenting this in court, the United States government actually declared national security and precluded the attorney from San Diego from testifying. That was part of the reason for why they had to settle the case. So whatever was happening, an enormous effort was made to conceal it by the American government.
And no one never figured out what federal agency that was?
It was DEA agents out of California and DOJ officials out of Washington, D.C.
Interesting.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So another part of your email, you mentioned, I'm in a position to discuss some of the challenges that our military forces would likely encounter in Mexico. Equally important, we can also discuss the second, third, and fourth order of consequences that we would face here in the United States. I'd love to take the conversation to this. Sure. So first of all, obviously the president deemed the cartel as a terrorist organization. And what are some of your thoughts on that alone?
I think that it was a wise move because Trump is clearly setting up a negotiation and he's manufacturing bargaining chips he's going to use with the Mexican government. That way he can agree to suspend the terrorist designation in exchange for the Mexican government doing what he wants. Essentially, he's going to be getting something for nothing. Trump is a very astute negotiator. With respect to the terrorist designation, it's not going to impact cartel operations in Mexico one bit.
Really?
Now, of course.
Why is that?
The men are already all looking at life sentences. Whether it's life sentence for Foreign Kingpin Act violations or terrorist organization operations, life is life. They're not going to, there's a phrase in Spanish called another strike for the tiger. Well, you can only get so many lives. Yeah,
so interesting. So in their head, they're damned if you do, damned if you don't. They're going to get in trouble either way, whether it be for a terrorist organization.
Now on the American side, it's very interesting because seeing how they only operate out of 3 distribution hubs and a logistical hub east of the Mississippi, you need trucks, tractor trailers. Well, now those drivers providing material support. That's a 20-year mandatory minimum. So you're going to be able to squeeze the low-level operators, the people manning the stash houses, the people that are running the local distribution hubs, the people that are running the local little courier services. So it's going to create a tremendous amount of leverage for the American prosecutors to squeeze the American side of the operations. It's also going to put at jeopardy a lot of the money laundering operations because banks are don't want to get hit with moving terrorist money. And so, had this been done 20 years ago, it really would have impacted their money laundering operations. Today, it's mostly through China. So again, it's not going to really impact that aspect. But the individuals that are physically collecting the bulk cash, they're now participating in terrorist-related activities. So they're going from 30-month sentences to 20-year sentences. And so you can see how it's going to create a tremendous disruption on the American side of the operations if our government plays it wisely.
Did you see the other day a video came out from one of the cartels mentioning that they have no intentions of creating any harm in America?
They have a zero tolerance policy for any violent acts in the United States. They do not target police. They do not target law enforcement. They do not target judges, prosecutors, witnesses, even cooperators. The only thing you can do in the United States to engender an act of violence is theft. Everything at that level is at the consignment level. So if you have a 200 kilo account, they expect you to come back with their $3 million. If you rip them off, they'll come see you. Short of that, there are no sanctioned acts of violence in the United States on behalf of any cartel organization. Now, if you set a man up, his brother might come see you. His cousin might come see you. That's a personal beef. That's not cartel organization sanctioned. So a lot of times you'll see where you'll have a personal issue, but because the guy's operating on his own, they conflate it and attribute it to the cartel organization. Whereas in reality, they have zero tolerance for violence against federal law enforcement in the United States or in Mexico. American police officers, untouchable in Mexico. American civilians, untouchable.
Really?
Yes, sir. 5 years ago, there was a group, the American government accused Sinaloa because there was a family in Sonora that was unalived. Terrible situation. Well, Sinaloa controls that border, but you have other groups that are their competitors. Well, it was the competitors group that unalived that family.
So are we talking about the family that was the LDS community?
Yes, sir.
We had one of the family members on this show.
Yeah, that wasn't Sinaloa. That was the group out of Juarez that's challenging Sinaloa for control of that plaza. So Sinaloa went, not only was it not Sinaloa, but Sinaloa went and unalived that entire group. And yet the American government still blames Sinaloa. They're like, what are you talking about? Like, it wasn't them. And they handled it for us.
Yeah.
So
what is the reason for that, I guess, for that choice, for them not to, which it's great to hear by way of, I spent a lot of time on the borders, but what was it initially that created that, like, hey, there's never a green light on America? There are only a handful of rules, and the stringent is no attacks upon American law enforcement. And that stemmed from back in the 1980s. The predecessor group was a structure called the Guadalajara Cartel. And the leadership within that group unalived a federal agent named Camarena. And it provoked such an enormous response from the American government that it ultimately fractured the Guadalajara Cartel, giving rise to the modern cartel structure. The reason, 40 years ago, Sinaloa, Sonora, Juarez, TJ, they were all local franchises of the larger Guadalajara group. So when they decapitated the leadership of Guadalajara, all those little franchises became standalone cartels. And so the men that were in charge back then, Chapo Guzman was in his 30s. Well, all the men that experienced the onslaught of pressure from the American government, because now we were sending bounty hunters into Mexico snatching guys up. There's 100 men in prison in the United States associated with the Camarena homicide. Most of them they didn't even know what happened. You got guys getting arrested in Juarez for a homicide that happened in Guadalajara. It was just indiscriminate picking people up. And so the reaction was so strong that the proverbial do not do anything to awaken the slumbering giant. Stay away from Americans at all costs. You mentioned in the email, and I would love to circle back to this, is what are some of the biggest challenges the United States military would face if deployed against cartels in Mexico?
There are fundamental difference between the cartels, and I can speak only about the Pacific side. I don't speak about the Gulf side. But on the Pacific side, Jalisco New Generation is much more militaristic. Sinaloa prides itself on being clever. So they're going to adopt a posture where they'll just take a lower profile. The group out of Jalisco is the more militaristic group, and it's known throughout the higher level trafficking community that their leadership for their paramilitary wing are 4 former U.S. Special Forces. You've got a Green Beret, a Green Beret, that's Delta Force, 2 Navy SEALs, and a Ranger from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Those are the leaders.
Oh, man. Hold on. I'm from the 75th Ranger Regiment.
Yes, sir.
Oh, my goodness. I've never heard this before. So the top 4 for the CJ&G.
Yes. Yeah, because, the guy that, when the Jalisco was part of Sinaloa, they were operating under the aegis of a drug lord named Nacho Coronel. Well, Nacho Coronel controlled Jalisco. Coronel's partner was Lobo Valencia. One of the Valencias is married to Mencho. So Mencho had the family connection, so he's ostensibly in charge of the group that at the time was called the Mata Zetas, the Zeta Killers. Well, he handled the money because he was a family member. they had the American Special Forces handle the actual building of their paramilitary. So they recruited former Mexican Special Forces, which is the next tier of leadership. Their main body is former Mexican military personnel, and then they bolster it with special forces from Central American countries, Honduras, El Salvador, Panama. These are all guys that come to the United States. They get trained by our guys at Bragg. They get trained at the School of the Americans in Georgia. And counterinsurgency type training. And so when they go back to their countries and they finish their tour of service, they get paid top dollar. Remember, Jalisco New Generation generates $3-4 billion a year. They can afford to pay these men top dollar. And so when they broke away and formed their own structure, the Matazetas became Jalisco New Generation. It's essentially a military wing that got involved with drug trafficking. Whereas Sinaloa was always drug traffickers that built a military wing. And so that's why you see where Jalisco particularly have had numerous encounters against the Mexican military. And one of the main concerns that I have is, look, the American military is the most powerful fighting force in the history of the world. We have career bureaucrats, however, who formulate plans that, quite frankly, aren't reasonable given the nature of the adversary you're fighting. You know, we spent $2 trillion and 20 years fighting in Afghanistan. We didn't lose a battle in Afghanistan. But yet today, the flag of the illiterate goat herder is flying over every flagpole in that country. But there's a reason why we lost. And it's not the military's fault. It's the career bureaucrat. The guys that go to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, they're not qualified to come up with plans when the adversary is a functionally illiterate Mexican with a second, third, or fourth grade education, any more than they were qualified to do so with an illiterate goat herder in Afghanistan. So now, the guys that are putting together these plans, they're already talking about collaborating with our partners in the Mexican government. Are you insane? You did an episode earlier about a gentleman named Hernando Garcia Luna. Hernando Luna was their Minister of Public Safety, their FBI director. Do you realize that 5 of the men in Calderon's cabinet split $270 million? We're not talking about crooked cops in Tijuana or in Matamoros. There's plenty of them. We're not talking about crooked military officers at the airbase in Sonora where they're landing the 737s. We're talking about cabinet level officers. The American government entrusted Luna with $4.5 billion over a 3.5-year period. They mobilized 5 military campaigns, 65,000 Mexican soldiers. And who was driving the entire time? The jackass is sitting up in the mountains of Sinaloa. Luna would ask, who do you want us to go get? I go get them guys in Michoacan. The gringos are paying for everything. Then 4 months later, Luna comes back to D.C. George Bush is praising him, saying this is a man of courage, strength, honesty. We finally have a partner in the war on drugs. He got paid $50 million from Sinaloa, jackass. You guys are cutting checks, giving them helicopters, tanks, troop transports. They initiated 5 military campaigns. Operation Michoacan, Operation Baja California, Operation Juarez. They went into Tamaulipas twice for the Zetas and the Gulf. Guess who didn't get an operation? Sinaloa. Because they paid the $270 million. So when you're talking about having military troops coming into the United States, if you're partnering with the Mexican government, how do you know that information is not going to get leaked? So when our men are going on their missions, they don't have the element of surprise. Their air assaults, they're dropping into ambushes planned by American Special Forces, supported by Mexican Special Forces. Twice the Mexican government has sent their special forces to try to get Mencho. On both times they got tipped off. On the ground assault, those soldiers went right into the ambush. They unalived every one of the Mexicans and left their bodies on the highway. Jalisco suffered not one injury. The Mexican government got so pissed off, they put together their most sophisticated elite unit of special forces. They were doing an air assault. Well, once again, one of the officers on the base called and tipped off his handler. Mencho and his men got into their SUVs and they were taking off. Here come the helicopters. They can see the caravan. They get into formations. They start descending. What happens? They start blowing helicopters out of the sky. They have SA-7s. They have man-bads. They've demonstrated the capacity to blow military helicopters out of the sky. Every one of the special forces on those helicopters died. So if you're going to send our boys into, and look, one of my best friends is an Army Ranger, 2 combat tours in Afghanistan. He said they were dropping into they were dropping into ambushes all the time. The Taliban didn't have inside info. You have to assume the Mexicans are going to know our guys are coming. That's a very different picture. So now if you say, well, we're going to cut out the Mexicans, well, even if you don't involve them with the info, where are you going to park your helicopters? You know, you see on YouTube, all these people talking, we're going to rotate our forces out of Texas. If you're going to go get Mencho's in the mountains of Jalisco, Michoacan. That's 1,200 miles from the border. You're going to fly a helicopter from Fort Bliss, 1,200 miles on one tank of gas? Drop off our men, circulate above, pick up our boys, and bring them back? That's 2,400 miles on one tank. Dodging rockets the whole time. And they know you're coming. And so it's not going to be the picture that's being presented is very flawed. You have almost nobody of any significance at the border. Sinaloa cartel doesn't have 25 guys at the border. Their highest ranking guy in TJ is an E9. He'll have 3 importation cells that report to him. They're led by E7s. The workers are E6s and E5s. That's it. Nobody in the leadership, nobody in the United States, they don't put their important people at risk. So you're not going to be going over the border and fighting cartel men. There's lots of criminals in TJ that are locally contracted. Sinaloa will sacrifice every man in Tijuana. They don't care. Jalisco will sacrifice every guy in Mexicali. They don't care. But if you're going to actually target the cartel operatives, you got to go 1,000 miles into country and fight them in their mountains. And their military wings are, like I said, special forces trained, American special forces led, using American special forces tactics.
Interesting. I've never heard that perspective, and sounds accurate.
Ironclad creates premium content no matter the environment. From extreme elements to unforgiving terrain, we thrive on crafting content that captures the essence of your brand in the most challenging conditions. Bring your brand story to life, ensuring your message leaves an impact. Ready to elevate your vision? Connect with us today at ironcladagency.com.
The question I have is, you said in your email that we can discuss the second, third, and fourth order of consequences. What would those be?
Well, certainly. Well, look, again, when you look at Afghanistan, the Taliban weren't able to project power. They could attack Americans in the form of American service members. Well, Mexico is home to the largest American expatriate community. There's 1.5 million Americans living in Mexico. In fact, the largest concentration of Americans living outside of America is in Jalisco. Go south of Guadalajara and Lake Chapala. Go to Puerto Vallarta. So if you've got 300,000 or 400,000 Americans living in Jalisco, you know what they're called? Hostages. Is there a plan to remove all the Americans out of Mexico? How are you going to protect all these people? So they can retaliate against American civilians, not that they ever would do so unprovoked. But once Predator drones start shooting rockets off or air assaults start happening, now what's to stop them from paying some stupid 15-year-old kid to go into a community center and start doing idiotic stuff? Well, there are people that they can strike back at in the form of American civilians in Mexico. That's a consequence. So you're sending our boys potentially into ambushes. That's the first order. The second order, you've got American civilians in Mexico. Third order, for the last 30 years, the American government and the Mexican government have integrated our economies. That's what NAFTA was. Well, you have over $150 billion of direct U.S. foreign investment in Mexico, right along the border, all those factories, warehouses, that entire structure. Well, you know what they have a lot of in Mexico? C4, dynamite, gasoline. How many of those structures are going to remain standing? So they're going to be able to inflict hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loss financially just by targeting the NAFTA-related businesses. They can target all of the banks. They understand that in the United States, the financial institutions and the corporate interests have a lot of influence with our government. So they'll just start targeting American banks. They'll start targeting American businesses. You can do hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damages without ever leaving Mexico. Now, once you get to the American side of the border, that's where it starts getting frightening. because you have teams that are highly trained in Mexico, and they have no problem getting their men across the border. So now let's just focus it on Southern California, because I know I'm from Los Angeles. Nearly everybody I love is in LA. Well, we have 5 airports in LA. We're 2 hours from the border. You've driven up the 405 freeway. As you're approaching LAX, the planes come right, or that's the flight path right over the highway. That whole area is residential, light industrial. How hard is it going to get the 2 guys in LA with a truck, drive right over by LAX, blow a civilian airliner out of the sky? Or they coordinate it, one in LA, one in Houston. Or they coordinate it, one in LA, one in Las Vegas, one in Houston. Now, what that does is that cripples civilian aviation. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth of financial strike. Plus, foreign countries won't allow their airliners to come to the United States because we can't protect our airspace. That's 4 Mexicans, 2 trucks, and 2 rockets can inflict hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage. You know, in preparation for this, I just said, I'm going to run this through ChatGPT and DeepSeek. The scenarios they proposed were shocking. They noticed that in Los Angeles, the greater metropolitan Los Angeles area has the highest concentration of people in the United States, over 18 million people. Well, our city is surrounded, Santa Monica Mountains, San Gabriel Mountains. Well, water nestled all up in the canyons. Our reservoirs. Now, does anybody have plans to put the 82nd Airborne in the San Gabriel Mountains to protect our reservoirs? 5 2-man team, 5 Toyota pickup trucks, $40,000 worth of chemicals. They can cripple the water supply in Los Angeles. Are there plans in place to make sure that we can provide water for 18 million people in Los Angeles? Our country couldn't get water to New Orleans for 3 days. And New Orleans, we've got suburbs in LA that are bigger than New Orleans. Well, you need to start thinking second, third, fourth order consequences by individuals who, once their backs are up against the wall, have the capacity to strike. And once they do one of these, what happens? The American government's going to double down. So now you're up on the precipice of going to war against Mexico. Well, Mexico's our largest trading partner, over $800 billion worth of commerce. So you're talking about crippling our economy, massive inflation, panic if the water supply in LA gets crippled. And these are the kind of things that you need to think through before you just start thinking, well, it's going to be a cakewalk. I see a lot of these guys on YouTube not having any idea of, like, look, these are trained individuals who are businessmen and don't want to interfere with their operations. But if pushed up against the wall.
I had someone message me and say, I give the cartel too much credit. And my reply to him was, it's the same as when we went to Afghanistan. You realize how they were just well suited for this really uncomfortable war, that as much as we can, take the fight to the enemy, we were still in their territory, and a guy in sandals was outrunning me. You know what I mean? Like, it was a different type of war. And if you don't give them the credit of the fact, like, okay, this is war, right? And anything can go. Well, there's a chance it's going to be a tough one. And I don't want to go to war. I don't say that. I'm just projecting that in the event that it gets to that level, a lot of people are saying we're going to blow them out of the water. I was like, well, I think about other things that can happen that make it very uncomfortable. And you're mentioning things now that it's just kind of making me think even more like, yeah, it's a scary thought to think of all the other consequences that could happen just based on the fact of how close we are within proximity to them, and how fully, Americans in Mexico and Mexicans in America. So it becomes a very blurred space.
Well, you have cities along the Southwest with large, the overwhelming majority of Hispanics are, of course, law-abiding. But that provides the cover for the guys to be able to operate. So what are you going to do? Put an APB out in LA, look for 2 Mexicans in a truck? Come on. It's not feasible. And you could think along, whether it's Phoenix, Las Vegas, you got Lake Mead, wide open. You've got every airport in the Southwest. And look at the advantages. Another advantage that they have over the Afghanis is they're right next door to the largest armory in the world, Texas. Those $2,500 sniper rifles that they're selling in Texas, in Mexico, they go for $10,000 a piece.
Yeah.
They buy 10 of them at a time. And
I was supposed to do a podcast on that.
And if the Texas guy is greedy, they'll pay him in product.
Let me ask you a question here. What's the right answer? How do we slow down this epidemic of opiates coming across our borders? How do we slow down these cartels without causing this mass catastrophe that could potentially happen by putting them, their backs to the wall? I don't know if America even thinks about that in the sense of like, fuck what they feel. Let's just go after them, take them out. But thinking more strategic, like how do you, someone who has the experience, someone who's been in this space for 30 years, who hears them talk, what's the answer for this?
Well, our country has lost the ability to outmaneuver our adversaries. When we send troops into Mexico, that's a concession that our leadership weren't smart enough to outmaneuver them. Again, Sun Tzu said the supreme mark of excellence is to subdue your enemy without firing a shot. And so I believe, and I don't get political, but I think Trump is actually more qualified than any other president to achieve the more modest objective of stopping the opioids. He's not setting himself up for stopping all drug trafficking because that's a war against free markets. And humans have unleashed two of the most powerful forces on our planet, nuclear forces and market forces. He's not going after the free market, but he can outmaneuver his adversaries to give up the fentanyl, because once you understand the purpose of the cartel is not to make money, but to ensure the safety of the constituent organizations, they can discreetly tell the Mexican government, look, let them know we'll take the kingpin strategy off the table. Mexico no longer send their people to the United States for prison. That's what they want. They don't want kingpin strikes. They don't want decapitation strikes. They want to serve their time in Mexican prisons. I had a friend who did 7 years in Mexican prison. He lived better than 90% of the men in the United States. Slept with 200 women, fathered 7 children with 6 women in 7 years in prison. Ate catered meals every day, made several tens of millions of dollars from his operation while in prison. Well, they know that if they come to the US, they go to ADX, like Guzman. So now, once you understand that their primary focus isn't making money, it's providing security, well, then you can address that concern. But what do we want in return? Stop the fentanyl. See, when we created the kingpin strategy, it was a very reasonable strategy. And this is going back to your point, because our leadership, not the political leadership, the senior bureaucratic leadership, the guys that go to Ivy League schools, don't understand that when you created the kingpin strategy, it would have been reasonable if the counterparty was Switzerland or Norway. But it was Mexico. What we did is we empowered the corrupt Mexican politician or police officer or general with leverage. Now they had a credible threat. Either you pay Genaro Luna $50 million or they're going to get you and send you to the US. But they got to pay. They got to pay Cienfuegos $60 million. When Peña Nieto, the next president, came into office, the facts I'm citing are the trial evidence that came to light in Guzman's trial. The man just won the presidency. He's president-elect, waiting to take office. He contacts Zambada's people and say, hey, me and my people, we need $250 million. That's off the top. Well, if you got to come up with $1 billion worth of bribes every year, you're a businessman. Are you going to take your capital and invest it in a compound that's going to bring you 150% return on investment? That's cocaine. Or an 800% return on investment? That's crystal methamphetamine. Or a 2,400% return on investment. That's fentanyl.
What president did that?
Peña Nieto. In fact, it's just released this week in Spanish language media in Mexico that Ismael Zambada has begun cooperating with the American government, and he has implicated the last 2 presidents, not Ms. Sheinbaum, not the one today, but he implicated AMLO and Peña Nieto. And it came out the trial, the evidence at Guzman's trial was that Peña Nieto demanded a $250 million bribe. Zambada said, no, we'll pay you $100 million, and he took the $100 million. Well, if you're dealing with a country whose presidents are taking 9-figure bribes, whose cabinet level officers are taking $50, $60, $70 million bribes, you don't have a reliable partner. That's what happened with us in Afghanistan. The whole time we're paying the Pakistanis, meanwhile, they're arming the Taliban. They're housing bin Laden, Zawahiri, the Quetta Shura. Well, you can't go into any kinetic action when your so-called ally is supporting your adversaries. Well, the Mexican government is going to be actively helping, not the government as an institution, but there is systemic corruption within the government. So even if Ms. Scheinbaum isn't dirty, is her chief of staff, is somebody on her, on her cabinet? What we learned from the Renato Luna trial, and Luna's doing 30 years today in American prison, he didn't start taking bribes at 54 years old when he was the FBI director. He'd already been taking bribes for 25 years. That means the guys that are 53, 54, 55-year-old cabinet officers today, hey, they may have been getting paid for the last 25 years. When they were landing the 727s at the air base in Sonora back in 1995, everybody on that chain of command was getting their envelope. Well, the second lieutenants then are the generals today. They've been getting paid for 30 years. So if you're going to partner with a corrupt institution, you know that they're going to thwart and undermine you at every turn, which is bad for our boys going into combat. But also, it's a fault of the high-level, senior-level bureaucrat. And this is where Trump is actually, he characterizes it as the deep state because he attributes a level of malevolence to them. I don't think they're acting in bad faith. They're just incompetent for this particular adversary. Now, if it's a debate over monetary policy at the Fed, listen to the guy from Harvard. But if it's a knife fight in a back alley in Michoacan, that Yale law degree doesn't help you. And the problem is we've got men who are creating proposals for our commander-in-chiefs to select from. You don't expect our president to be an expert in 20 or 30 different subjects. He's got to rely upon his advisors. But if the advisors don't have familiarity with the adversary, how they think, how they operate, you're going to keep coming up with these silly ideas like the Kingpin strategy. All you did was arm Renato Luna to get $50 million a year. So the leverage was created by the American government. So the parties in Mexico, the government and the drug lords, are operating in an environment shaped by American policy. Well, we have to be able to be a little bit more intelligent. We have to shape the adversary's incentives to align with ours. What do they want? No decapitation, no coming to the United States. What do we want? No fentanyl. There's a deal to be made. Because they can still make all their money on coke and crystal. See, today, the United States government is desperate to get back to where we were with Mexico in 2014. There was no fentanyl coming out of Mexico in 2014. That was all China. If the president can get where we were back in 2014, 2015, he'd go down as one of the greatest presidents in history. Now, what's interesting is, here I got to show you that this is Joaquin Guzman's indictment. This is the indictment that he got prosecuted on. He was arrested in January 2016. This indictment was filed in May of 2016. There was never been an indictment written like this in American history. Millions of kilos of cocaine, hundreds of tons of coke, hundreds of tons of crystal, billions of dollars worth of drugs, foreign drug kingpin, multiple importation conspiracies, $15 billion worth of forfeitures. What word does not appear in this indictment? Fentanyl. Today, the government of the United States is desperate to get back to where things were when Chapo was in charge. If we could just get back to where it was with Chapo, you'd be saving 95,000 Americans every year. Well, that's why you have to think and anticipate what's going to happen. Every time you remove a drug lord, every time results in a spike in product coming to the United States, and whoever comes next has to be an even bigger scumbag. It's happened, whether, they celebrate, they took out Pablo Escobar in a decapitation strike. Okay, great. That was 1993. What happened in 94? Double the amount of cocaine. If the goal is reducing the amount of product coming to the United States and your actions double it, how's that a win? We spent $2 trillion in Iraq, lose thousands of men, tens of thousands of combat-related injuries, and today, who got the prize? The Iranians. You can't spend $2 trillion so that your adversary gets the prize. That's not garden variety level incompetence. That's not run-of-the-mill level incompetence. That's Harvard level of incompetence. You have to go to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government to be that big of a dipshit to spend $2 trillion for your adversary to get the prize, or for the illiterate goat herder armed with AK-40s and AK-47s and fertilizer to keep the country. Well, it's the same reason why you can't win this drug war, because the people creating the policies don't understand the adversary. They're up against people with a highly attuned sense of survival and a highly developed sense of street smarts. And you need to, at a minimum, start incorporating market forces. There's a way to manipulate your adversary without having to resort to violence. You just have to be smarter than them. And our government has given up, from what I've seen, on trying to outsmart people. And one positive thing that Mr. Trump has done, you can see he's setting up a negotiation with the Mexican government. We're not going to deal with drug dealers. We're just going to deal with the Mexican government. Let them look foolish. Let them look weak. But he's manufacturing bargaining chips for himself. He's going to maneuver them because he can threaten them with enormous financial consequences. They have to lose face by conceding a little bit to the drug cartels.
I have a question.
Sure.
Canada. I've heard that there's Sinaloa in Canada or people from Sinaloa who manage the drugs coming in from Canada. Have you heard anything about this?
I've heard that there are Mexican nationals in Canada, none of them having anything to do with any cartel operation. The cartel operates in the United States in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and over by Bragg. Now,
all the drugs come, right? So all the drugs come from there are somehow tied to it in some different way?
Coming from Canada? The amount of drugs coming in from Canada is very modest, and most of that is ecstasy. That's controlled by the 14K triad. You know, we have 4 triads in Los Angeles, and the 14K office in the United States is in Orange County. And they're
what is that? The triads. Can you explain that?
Well, in Los Angeles, we have 4 Chinese triads. So we've got large Asian communities. Yes. So in downtown and Chinatown, we've got the Sun Yee-on. Out in the San Gabriel Valley, out by where I grew up, you've got the Wo Hap To. And you've got down in Orange County, the 14K. And then off the 60 freeway by Montebello area, you've got a Taiwanese triad, which are, Taiwanese are ethnic Chinese. And that's the Four Seasons. And so those triads operate in conjunction with the group out of Vancouver. So you see a lot of the product that comes into the United States from Canada is actually Chinese based. Also, the Chinese procure the chemicals. And so you'll have chemicals coming through Vancouver, come south to go into Mexico.
I seen, some of the email that you said pretty much in the back end of it is about the veterans who are participating in the veterans reentry during the 5-year stint as the program coordinator, right? You were the program coordinator for the veteran program? Yes, sir.
And I was shocked that the Bureau had come up with such an impactful program. By that point, I was like 18 years into my bid. And I was like, oh, another one of these bullshit dog and pony programs. And it literally changed the lives of probably hundreds of men. Like nobody left prison without a job. Nobody left prison homeless. Your credit was repaired. You left with all your documentation, your post-secondary education, whether it was through the GI Bill or through Pell Grants, everything was lined up. Guys were leaving prison, reporting to the halfway house, 3 days later, starting at the local community college, getting their classes for the CDL.
Can you explain what this program is for those who are listening who might not?
It's a program designed for those federal prisoners with prior U.S. military service. And it was designed to assist those prisoners achieve their reentry goals. And so the program coordinated with the VA, of course, and the Department of Defense. And so when it started as a pilot program, 16 and 17 were pilots. By 18, it started becoming known throughout the system. By 19, Trump had already sent his bureau, the BOP director, who was a former Army general, a guy named Minch, to come inspect the program. I spent half an hour talking to him. I've given probably 36 tours of that program. By the time I signed my halfway house papers in January 23, over the 5-year period leading up to that period, the recidivism rate was down to 1%. Whereas standard in the rest of the Bureau, it's at 40, 45, 50, some prisons at 60%.
Yeah.
And so this program was incredibly impactful. You had a lot of combat veterans come back, a lot of men from Iraq, a lot of men from Afghanistan, A lot of men with PTSD issues. So the VA was coming in, they were bringing in the counselors, they were getting the men to treatment, into programs, because a lot of them got in trouble because, they come back, their lives fall apart, marriages break apart, they can't hold a job. They are really in a position to stabilize themselves, get themselves grounded. And it was a great program because you had the older guys from the Vietnam War. So you got guys in there with 2 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart, another guy with 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star. Right. He's talking to the young 25-year-old who just got back from Iraq and made mistakes. And so it was an opportunity for the guys it was a residential-based program. We lived in a separate unit. The place was always sparkling. I mean, it was spotless. It was very respectful. At 10 o'clock, it was lights out. You didn't have people getting drunk or getting high or having sex in the bathrooms and stuff. It was just a very respectful, clean, quiet living environment. And the program was designed with the 5 main workshops to get the men in a position to not fail when they get released. And, whether it was transitional housing so that people can facilitate a move to a new city because one of their Army buddies gave them a job, but you can't transfer cities unless you have an address. But the guy doesn't have an address. So then we go to the VA, they put him in transitional housing. I mean, it's the little things that are the difference between someone coming back because he gets frustrated, he's got no money, he's broke, he's living in his car, and he knocks off a liquor store. Or you help them for those first couple, 2-3 months, and boom, now they're on their feet. And the program was remarkable. I mean, by the end of it, we had tours coming in from CENTCOM, people coming in from DOD. In 2022, the Bureau adopted it and made it available now nationwide. There are veterans reentry programs in every federal institution.
It's cool.
Yeah, we had a remarkable warden and a remarkable program director, Jody Ward, and the warden, Miss Kathy Lane. And they went to bat. And what was shocking is, this wasn't a program initially sponsored by the Bureau. Miss Ward came out of her pocket to start the program. So for the first 3 years, it wasn't funded. And so it wasn't until that Army general came and saw it. He's like, man, replicate this, scale it all up. And, look, there's always going to be people with negative attitudes. They didn't get anything out of it. But if you came in with the right attitude and you just say, look, humble yourself a little bit. I need help. My wife left me. I'm getting released, homeless in Atlanta. I don't got an address. Can you get me an address in Nashville? Boom, we got you. Well, men need to come out of prison with a job. They need a roof over their head. They need their credit repaired. They need their driver's license. They need all their documentation. They need their post-secondary education. If they got any military benefits coming, they got with all their benefits. I was getting guys Agent Orange pay from the 1970s from Vietnam.
Oh, cool.
Guys are getting $300,000, $400,000 checks. Had no idea they were even eligible for this. Now, they can't receive the money while they're in prison, so it's held for them until they get released. So these are men in their 70s that are going to be able to, help their grandkids pay for their college. You really see it touched a lot of people in a way that the Bureau's programming never does. And so I was very proud to be associated with that program.
I'm glad to hear it. And I've had friends who go, find their way in prison, make mistakes, but
Sure.
It's really nice to hear that there's some kind of program.
Yes, sir.
I have only a couple questions left, but one of the big questions is, why did you want to speak out about this? What is it about this that you wanted to make sure you got the platform and talked about it?
Well, I'm an author and I do speaking engagements and I do appear on podcasts. And I hope to get people to understand that we can prevail being a little bit more sophisticated. Work to outsmart your adversary. At a minimum, there are men in the United States that are massive traffickers who, did their time in prison, who have insights into how these operations are structured. I'm talking about me. I can give you names of a dozen guys. Create a red team. Ask them, how would they respond? Just like the Kingpin strategy is a perfect example. Or what's going to happen when you take out Nacho Coronel? Well, what's going to happen. These organizations are going to fracture. They're going to have an infighting. The guy that takes over, he's Mencho. Today, you got a new generation. Well, had you just left Nacho Coronel in charge, you'd have no fentanyl coming out of Jalisco. You took out Arturo Beltran. His organization fractured. They fought. They reconstituted. Today, they're the Cartel of the Northeast, the largest fentanyl producers in Sinaloa. Had you just left Beltran in place, or Nacho Coronel in place, or Joaquin Guzman in place, you wouldn't have exacerbated the very problem you're trying to address. So instead of defining situations narrowly, thinking, I'm going to get this guy, well, it's what's the consequences of getting this guy? Because whatever comes next, by definition, has to be worse. When you break up an organization's factions, each faction is going to fight for control. In Mexico, power is defined by access to corrupt political figures. To have that power, you need money. So now you've got 6 organizations rather than 1. And what are these 6 doing? They're all scrambling to raise capital. So what do they got to do? They got to flood the market. Every time you take out a kingpin, you flood the market. They got to raise capital to buy politicians, to buy hitmen, to buy weapons. You're incentivizing your opponent to do the very thing you're trying to stop. And that's why I would like to add that voice to the conversation, simply saying, look, of course our military can defeat these guys. But there's a much smarter way to move than creating circumstances where American citizens in Mexico could be at risk, American citizens in Southern California can be at risk, or in Southern Texas, or along the border in Arizona. I mean, this isn't Afghanistan. Now, their business model is they don't harm Americans, but those rules were in place before Predator drones were striking them in Guadalajara.
Last thing, is there any message you'd like to tell some of the young people that might be tempted or allured to the drug trade?
You know, I've spoken with many groups of younger guys, and, you know, young men are always going to be attracted to, you know, fast cars, fast money, fast women. And so the initial part of the conversations, I go along with it. I talk some of the stories. Having a good time. But then I point out the fact that, look, it's not worth the 30-year sentence. When you're in prison and you can't come for your mother when your father died or your brother died, when you're not there to help your family or help your children, when one of your friends is hitting on your girlfriend or hitting on your wife while you're away, like, those are the things you have to think about. The people that you think are your friends are the ones who are going to tell on you. You know, I made the mistake following my arrest. I turned down 3 opportunities to cooperate. I'd have gotten 5 years. I turned that down because I'm protecting my friends. One of them was my best friend, Joey. 20 months into my pretrial custody, he flips on me. Like, what am I doing in jail protecting these guys? And then they cut my throat. Like, I should have just cut all their throats coming in the front door. I'd have been home in 2000 rather than in 24. And so those are the lessons I try to express to the younger guys. Like, hey, it's all fun and games when you've got the money. I get it. The cars, the money, the women. Believe me, I understand. I fell into that trap. But you're 25 years old, because a lot of the guys like, hey, well, they're going to get out. They're going to get back to work. Like, they got another run in them. I said, are you insane? You're looking at a mandatory minimum 20 years on a second offense. I got a 30-piece on a first offense. Now, granted, it's because of a significant amount of product, but at a minimum, it's 20. Even for some broke-dick joker, it's 20 because of a prior conviction. I said, are you prepared to do 20 over what? And then every man that leaves federal prison, you got a bullseye on your back. So everybody knows that they can get out of jail by giving you up. Because the American government's always going to go for the prior convicted drug kingpin from federal prison. And so I lay out the consequences. Like, I don't come in with the happy talk. You know, I don't come in with the faith-based. That's not my place to speak. I come in with cold, hard reality. If you choose to return, understand you're going to get 20 years. You're going to get 30 years, and these are the consequences. And you're going to think for the next 25 years, why not just take that deal? Because everybody you love betrays you to protect themselves. And I've had numerous younger guys come in and say, you know, I thought I had another run in me, but I'm going to take that CDL course. Because at least being a commercial driver, you don't have to worry about the FBI jacking you off.
Yeah. Well, Pierre, I honestly really appreciate this conversation we've had. So much here. I think we're going to have to call you back for a second one. There's a lot to unpack. But sure. Thank you so much, honestly, for giving us your expertise and your information.
No problem, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Borderland, Narcosis, and Ironclad Original. This interview for me was kind of an insider look at what the Sinaloa cartel really looks like and what we've been told that might not necessarily be true. So for me, I loved it, and I'm very interested in looking deeper into what he had to say. Take care.